The final section of Theme 2 is African Traditional Institutions of Governance. This is also pretty important for the exam, so please make a note. We'll start in South Africa and speak about issues around chieftaincy and kingship. Again, important for the exam. Now, chieftaincy is more than a simple political institution. It represents the importance of unity in both social and political life. So it's not the same kind of thing as like an executive or a legislature or a judiciary. This is an institution in its own right that has a deep social and historical link to its people. So they are social leaders rather than government institutions. And also another important point is that traditional leadership is inherited through kinship ties. So if you wanted to assume the leadership position, you had to be related by a tie of kinship or through common ancestry. So, through blood, through a bloodline. And then thus traditional leaders would qualify for office by their ancestry alone, which of course is different to a democratic system where you would vote somebody in. Okay, so you get into power through blood alone. And the primary role of the chief in this kind of chieftaincy or kingship is to regulate social behavior within the community of which he or she has control. Now, in South Africa's situation, we have a constitution that guarantees rights to traditional leaders. There's a whole chapter on it, in fact. And the first line in this chapter is, the institution, status and role of traditional leadership, according to customary law, are recognized subject to the Constitution. Because, of course, the Constitution is still the overarching or supreme law of the land. Have a look at this URL below. If you're interested in really looking this stuff up, there's much more information available at this URL link. Section 212 of the Constitution states the following. National legislation may provide a role for traditional leadership as an institution at local level on matters affecting local communities. To deal with matters relating to traditional leadership, the role of traditional leaders, customary law, and the customs of communities observing a system of customary law, then a national or provincial legislation may provide for the establishment of houses of traditional leaders and establish a council of traditional leaders. Now, in a democratic society like South Africa, how might there be a problem? How might there be a clash? Or how might these two institutions come up against each other? For example, democracy as an institution and all its branches of power, executive, legislature, and judiciary, and African traditional institutions of governance, because they are two different kinds of systems. So, for example, chieftaincy operates on principles that are generally antithetical to democratic ideas and values. This is what some people say anyway, so you might disagree. But for example, a chief is not elected into office by popular vote. But a chief becomes a chief because of lineage, so is in office for life, sort of like a queen, like Queen Elizabeth II in England. So it's an inherited thing. It's the point I was making about those, either the kinship ties or the ancestry, this bloodline kind of thing. So that's one example. And the second one is that chieftaincies tend to be quite patriarchal in nature. This means that largely, in many situations, women are excluded from office. They don't have many rights in terms of customary law, and it can be quite oppressive to women. So these are just two examples where chieftaincies might be antithetical to so-called democratic ideas or values that are operating at the time in a state, like South Africa, which is a constitutional and social democracy. Now, African traditional institutions of governance are obviously diverse. If you consider how big the continent is and how many ethnic groups there are, you can imagine that this would be the case. They've also evolved significantly over time, so from their pre-colonial forms, together with the transformation of the continent's political systems, to during the colonial times, and then of course in the post-colonial eras. But there are generally two main types that can be identified, and this goes way back to pre-colonial times as well, and various aspects of these still exist today in tribes, etc., and chieftaincies all over Africa. So the first one is the consensus-based system of the decentralized pre-colonial political system, and chieftaincy of the centralized political systems. Now, it's important to note this because, say this comes up in the exam, you would need to write down these two different systems and be able to explain a little bit about them and give some examples. We'll begin with decentralized authority systems. Now, these systems are based on the respect for the rights and views of the individual, because individuals can veto the opinions of the majority. Remember in class when I spoke about veto, this idea of being able to say no to something or disagree with something or express a different view or say you don't want that, so you veto it. But at the same time, individuals were also expected to respect the wishes and interests of the community by accepting compromises because they understood that they still lived within that community. Even though they're individuals, they live inside a community, and they could face censure from that community, including social isolation, if they did not respect the wishes of the community as well. So that's just an interesting point. Also, the extent to which minority views were accommodated enabled those systems to prevent conflicts between minority and majority segments of a community. And, importantly, it avoids the existence of political and social gaps between the governed and those who governed. Why? Because all eligible members of the community participate in both the creation and the enforcement of rules. So this is very much an example of direct democracy, working really in practice. And also, just interestingly, when individuals were appointed for specific tasks, then the duration of that appointment was often short, so probably not exceeding a year in most cases, which just meant that there was a lot of room for rotation and for accountability and those kinds of things, because you have movement of people, which is always interesting. Here are some examples of this decentralized system. You have the Eritrean Baito over here in the top left, just a picture of that. The Oromo people from Ethiopia also engage in this kind of decision-making. Kiyama, Kikuyu elders in Kenya down here, and the Igbo or Ibo, depending on how you pronounce it, Council of Elders in Nigeria. Now, one drawback of the decentralized authority system is that decision-making can be quite slow, since you're trying to build a consensus, which is always a time-consuming process because everybody has to have their say. It can take a long time, so it is slow. Here are some examples of other examples. I've given you the ones about the Igbo, the Eritrean village of Baito Assembly, the Garda or age-set system of the Oromo in Ethiopia, the Kiyama of the Kikuyu, the Teso and Nanga of Uganda, the Tonga of Zambia, the Nuer of Southern Sudan. These are all examples of this kind of system. And also, if you look further down, the Berber in North Africa. So in an exam, you obviously can't write all of this, especially if this comes up as a paragraph question for 5 marks. So if I asked you to discuss traditional systems of governance, then you would probably think about it. You would need to discuss both of them, both kinds. So say what they are, write a couple of sentences on what they mean, and a few examples for both, and that would be fine. The second type is this centralized political system. Now, while some parts of Africa had the decentralized one I just spoke about, other areas established centralized systems of governance with kings and monarchs. And the level of centralization and concentration of power varied from place to place, obviously, like in Abyssinia, this is Ethiopia now, but formerly Abyssinia, and in Rwanda, the rulers enjoyed absolute power. But in most other cases, the power of the rulers was restrained to some degree, including by institutions of councils, and they formed checks and balances. But of course, these mechanisms of checks and balances differed from place to place. Like the Buganda of Uganda and the Nupe, I think it's Nupe in Nigeria, the formal institutions of checks and balances here were quite weak, whereas the Ashanti of Ghana and in Lesotho and in the Swana of Botswana and in Uganda as well, the systems of checks and balances were better defined because there were constitutional provisions and customary laws authorizing a council of elders, religious leaders, and administrative staff of the chiefs to check the power of the leaders and keep them accountable. Now, if you look at this from the perspective of contemporary democracy as we understand it today, the formal mechanisms of accountability in the centralized African traditions were quite weak, because in those traditions, the chief basically combined the executive and judicial powers and the councils together, and they comprised largely of members of the nobility or close relatives of the chiefs. And this is kind of like, I would say a common comparison might be cadre deployment, with political parties moving people into certain positions. It's kind of like that to a degree, because the idea is that you would surround yourself with people who would support you. And what the chiefs would do in this instance would be to do the same. So family members would be moved into these positions, and they would support the chief and not go against the chief. So that was good in terms of creating solidarity and promoting this stability throughout the age. But also, it's not very good in terms of accountability, because you're not going to keep the person accountable because they're your family. So, still, other informal mechanisms also fostered accountability. For example, sometimes the common people would just shift their allegiance away from the chief to other chiefs. And this was an important way to try and mitigate the autocratic or like despotic dictatorship type tendencies of chiefs. It's important to note, though, although centralized systems were characterized and are characterized by a great deal of power at the top, there is actually quite a lot of autonomy at the bottom too, in many cases. So at grassroots level, the chief then acts as a facilitator primarily. He presides over a consensual decision-making process by the members in that chieftaincy or the elders in their communities. And at grassroots level, the system then overlaps in many respects with a decentralized one. because the administrative structure of the Ashanti, for example, in Ghana, allows each lineage, village, or subdivision to manage its own affairs, which includes, by the way, settling disputes through arbitration by elders. And then, of course, you have in Botswana also, the power of the chiefs is also regulated by the consensual decision-making process in the Khotla. So those are two very interesting examples. Okay, that brings us to the end of this discussion around African traditional systems of governance. Please remember my point about this being important for the exam. There is also an article on ULink that you can go and read, and those two URL links if you want to find out more about this. Okay, next time we do Policy Making and Bureaucracy, Theme 3.